Okay, so growing up, female writers I was obsessed with Louisa May Alcott. However, I had only ever read Little Women, and she had these series that were like small stories of the Little Women. So like I was obsessed with Jo, and she had a story that was just about Jo. It had the other sisters in it, but it was just focused on Jo, and I was obsessed with her. And the one story was where Jo decided that she was going to sacrifice herself and go live with her grandmother because her family didn't have enough money to support all of the sisters. So I was obsessed with Jo because Jo refused to get married just because like that was what she was supposed to do. She waited until she was actually in love, and she was a writer, and up until, well, ever, I wanted to be a writer. So I was in love with Louisa May Alcott, and then Jane Austen came into my life, and I wanted to be her, and Pride and Prejudice became my obsession, and Elizabeth Bennet also refused to get married just because she was supposed to. Became a theme in my early childhood where rebellion, really, because not doing things just because you're supposed to. And her speech where she just yells at Mr. Darcy because he's being just horrible, despite the fact that she doesn't realize that he's actually not. So when she's just like, the last person I would ever marry is you, I'm just like, during the movie and the book, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is magic. I tend to prefer literature written by women because it makes me feel empowered to be a woman, and it makes me feel like I could totally write and make that my living, because overall, I mean, women throughout the ages have done so already.
So Charlotte Bronte and her strong female character Jane Eyre has significantly impacted my life because it's taught me how I should respect myself and subsequently my actions in relationships with others, romantic or not. And Jane Eyre really was a good example of this because she always put herself first and always had a strong self-respect no matter what situation was happening. So she definitely was like a very big example in how I should act in life.
Well, modern writers such as Mary Higgins Clark, Janet Ivanovich, um, they are not necessarily influential in me as a writer, but they've definitely been influential in me as a reader because they were who my mom read while I was growing up and were the first people who I was reading because of that. So I picked up the book that my mom just read and I was like, oh, well, I'll read this because it was like on the counter. And so I read all of Mary Higgins Clark's books up until I started college, really, and then she started still cranking out books. And then I learned really what a well-made novel was and decided that they really weren't what I wanted to read anymore. Her novels are the same novel, just with different character names. And then Janet Ivanovich. For the first couple books, I was riveted by her and the idea that you could write a novel. Is that this?
No, you're fine.
But like you could write a novel and have so many characters and prolong the inevitable for so long. She has characters that you know are supposed to be doing something, but they don't for like 5 books, and you're like, come on, let's get this going, and then all of a sudden, like, it happens, and you're like, well, that was really disappointing. But then all of a sudden, she like fixes it, and you're in the next book, and so just it made me want to read more. Not necessarily of them in particular, but wanted to make me read because I was like, oh, the next book is coming out. So I was like, go to the bookstore. Well, maybe I would pick up that book and then I'd go to the next aisle and be like, oh, well, this book looks interesting. So they were definitely influential into getting me to go and get books. And it was definitely a bonding experience for my mom and I because we were always like, oh, well, did you get to this part yet? And we'd be like, oh, well, that was so interesting. It's like, oh, are you team this or that? Or do you know who the killer is yet? And that was always really funny. And in every Mary Higgins Clark book, we were always betting who could figure out who the killer was first. Honestly, early on, my mom always won, but I learned quickly. But I don't think that it's always about necessarily the strong character that they build necessarily, but how they write the book and what comes out of it. And what came out of what they wrote was my love of reading and the bond between my mother and I for reading. And sometimes that's enough. So.
Yeah.
So Ayn Rand would be the author that has influenced me the most. She actually created this whole philosophy called objectivism, which kind of makes mankind, like as individuals, their own heroes, which has a lot to do with like putting your own happiness first, which I think has had a big impact on me because, I mean, like, life can be kind of hard sometimes. Like, I think everyone can relate to the struggle, but reading her work reminds you that you're what's important in your life. So, I mean, I think some people think that that's kind of a selfish view, but if you really, like, dig into it, it's not. It's not that you put yourself over other people, but that you take care of yourself, and that everything that you do should be done for you, not for other people. So I think that that's really structured my life in a big way because it helped me move forward and, like, chase my own dreams for my own reasons.
My idea of women in literature is kind of based on experience. I'm not going to say that I've read the most books and am an expert on this by any means, but I really feel like it is a sort of piece that evolves with the times. If you kind of look in the more historic literature, and maybe not, I'm not talking about like in the history books or anything like that necessarily, but if we go back and read a novel in the times before this whole dispute with women's rights, like way before where we are today, you see a lot of the mistreatment of women and the lack of the author giving women that sort of powerful role that you kind of see a lot more in today's literature. And I think just it's really interesting to see how literature has evolved with the times and kind of gives women a source of relation in all sorts of different situations, whether it be race, upbringing, socioeconomic status, anything in between. Literature is just a really powerful tool to help those women relate and to provide them with some sense of direction. And I really think it's also a powerful tool just to combat the problems that we still have with denying women's rights and seeing any mistreatment of women. It's really cool to see how literature is being used to combat that and to kind of push forward. It's like literature is always cycling and evolving on top of itself to the point where these ideas are becoming more and more prevalent and they're kind of being more and more accepted over time. So yeah, it's really something that interests me and really something that's interesting to think about when you really delve into it.